Mediopolis, Chapter 12. Show Friends. Mr. Porter was going upstairs. He felt like he drifted between the different groups of the house. And he was known by different names to those different groups as well, even just in the last few weeks, since moving into the family show. He was Mr. Porter to some people, but he was known as Curter. Well, he'd been Curtains before, Mr. Curtains, and still had retained the name Curt for many years after, even when he retired from the curtaining professions. He still carried the name Curt because he liked it and he'd called it a long time. He was used to it, and other people he'd known that carried on knowing him after his retirement from making, designing, and also installing different curtains in different shows that the curtains were used in. Those people he still was acquainted with, still know him as Curt, just a nickname short for Curtains. Old Curtains was one of the names he was known as. Before he went into portering, he didn't really get to know many of the people working that closely, didn't become closely familiar to the people in the hotel or the hospital portering either. It was mostly just moving people up and down long corridors, moving people around, moving luggage around often, escorting them to and from the right correct room to the correct floor, up and down different corridors, making sure that they're okay, visiting them with food, drink, and different things, for delivery services as well as escorting them up and down to the right room, floor, or the right place, either within the hotel at first, and then later into the hospital as well, where he'd be moving people to the different ward rounds, moving long beds, pushing them up and down the corridors, or wheeling chairs with patients in them who he'd only talked to very briefly on the long journeys between floors, up and down escalators, or visiting the various rooms in the far-flung corners of the great giant complexes that they often were. He worked in some large complex hotels, and then later also complex hospitals too, where he was a later porter there. And he'd been known as Mr. Porter after that by the friends and family that he'd lived with at the time, because that was his profession, his job, portering. He was porter. He was a porter. But he was the only porter that they really knew that well, because it was only a small family that he'd lived with at that time. Some of them still knew him at the local pub and some of the other community centres he visited as Curt from the olden days, Curt the Curtains. So there was some confusion over the name, and he wanted to try and clarify that to the family, but there really hadn't yet been the opportunity where they'd been available to listen to. So some of them still knew him as Curt the Curtains, or Old Curtains, Mr. Curtains, perhaps to a few, because they'd heard him being referred to as that by others in his long telephone conversations that they'd often overheard, thinking that Curt was perhaps his original name, and that his show name that he'd chosen later when he'd gone on the care shows with the show mother that visited him on the care show. Perhaps he'd only chosen that name, Seeker, and gone by Seeker Porter, Mr. Seeker Porter, as a later name once he'd been on the care show. Perhaps it was just a show name that he'd chosen, no longer wanted or wished to be known as Curt or Old Curtains, not any more. Perhaps he felt a long enough time had passed, a lot of distance, so much time that he no longer felt a close connection to himself within the curtaining professions. He'd lost contact and touch with so many in the years since that he really felt more in contact with the few colleagues he'd known from his portering roles and the family that had known him as a portering worker too. He rumbled up the stairs, going up slowly and looking around at the hallway decor. The family pictures still hung on the wall that changed every so often, updated according to the latest family incidents that had happened. Sometimes they'd be all together, sometimes it would just be those that were currently resident and present living in the house. Often the visiting family members, if they were visiting for that time, their images also would appear in the various hanging pictures, up and down the walls, lining the hallways, and up and down the stairways too. Mr. Porter was glancing at some of those images and the updated ones, noticing the elder visiting student's son. His image now had been added to that of the rest of the family also, and he appeared with them in many of the pictures now, whereas he'd been absent from them earlier. There was talk of his tutor, or several of his tutors, visiting at some point during the next few weeks. Well, he could find out when from the digital calendar that the eldest daughter had told him about earlier in the kitchen. All those programmed visits were in there, even the other programmed visits for the other family members. The elder son, his programmed visits from the tutors and the other students that would visit. Not that he'd be that interested in all of the others, but he was interested perhaps in some of the other tutors that would be visiting, in the subjects that the older man, Mr. Porter, would be interested in too. He got a little curious over the years of having some family that were interested in theology studies. They'd been visiting about different theology shows and got his interest up in it more over the years. And hearing that the elder son that was studying theology studies, hearing about his own studies of the theological shows, of the Divinity Film series, and all the subsequent spin-off series that have resulted from that, he was curious perhaps maybe he'd get a chance to meet one of the theological professors, one that would be studying with him, with the elder son that was, for a brief period. He was scheduled to visit apparently in the next few weeks. He'd be going to stay in one of the guest rooms along the guest floor in one section of the house that was mostly emptied. Along that corridor itself was Mr. Porter's room. There were several other guest rooms further up along the corridor, ones that were locked. He hadn't looked inside, but he was assured were just of similar design and style to his own, very bland and pale, with very little furniture, just a bed, some tables and drawers, a cupboard and wardrobe to store away his various items, clothing, books, his studies, and different equipment that he carried with him. With him it was the small amount of medication, some books, and some various objects of personal interest. Some memorabilia that he carried around, a few sentimental artefacts collected from various family members, those that he'd lived with in years earlier, in his portering and earlier tailoring, curtaining days. Things that he still carried around in a few assorted boxes. He'd have them all moved on from his old apartment into the new guest room on the guest floor of the guest wing of the family show house. There were several other further rooms, further up beyond the empty rooms, that he hadn't ventured too far down to, where some of the other visiting aunts would occasionally stay, where Aunt Taller, as she'd first introduced herself, and been introduced by the mother, was currently staying. Many luggage was being loaded up there now and again by Mr. Noah, or Noah Mr. Dreams, whatever his name really was. He'd been introduced in several ways, both by himself and then the mother, or the friend, as he called her. Wasn't sure quite yet what to call him, would establish that perhaps later, and whether he was staying in one of the more distant guest rooms or with the mother, well, he didn't think to ask, didn't want to ask, and it wasn't his place to do so either, he felt. Nevertheless, there were several other further rooms, more distant, further along that same corridor. Those, he was told, were the rooms of the regular aunts and uncles, even though they only visited occasionally. But still, they were regular enough over many years that they did store some of their belongings there, so that they could have them there waiting for them on each of the visits that might happen. Mr. Porter strolled up the stairs, thinking hopefully he might be able to ask the son on going to collect him and ask him and his friends to join the rest of the family downstairs for the opening of the presents. He might be able to get the chance to ask him whether he might talk to his theological study partner. He might get to talk to some of the theological study partners, but more than that, he wanted to talk to the theological professor who'd be visiting and staying in one of those guest rooms, perhaps for a few days. He didn't know at what time exactly, sometime the next few weeks, according to the schedule. There were a number of other professors who'd be visiting also. Each would visit for a few days at a time. They went round to visit and stay with all of their students and had a great many to travel round and visit with and do their short stays with, to do various assessments and to make sure that they were updated and to also listen to the parts of the dissertation and give their feedback on it too. Perhaps he could steal a few hours or ask to borrow a few hours of the time of the old Theo professor that would be visiting the student for a few days at least. Well, he wouldn't be there doing the studying for all of that time, and they wouldn't be studying together for all of that time. He'd do his own studies separate and be in contact with many other students through the computer, doing and watching various videos that he'd be marking and grading, but he'd also be in regular contact with other colleagues, with the school itself perhaps, and with his own family at sometimes too, where he could keep in contact, all the professors could, through their video link, having video chats with their own partners, children, and the rest of their wider family too. Of course, the old theological professor, Theo, middle-aged Theo, apparently he was middle-aged. He would only be there for a few days. Perhaps he'd get a chance to go and look around the area and to visit a few of the other students nearby too. It was just convenient that he could be housed with this particular one. And the mother did host various other professors that could visit other students that went to the same college too. It was part of the scheme that she'd signed up for, and it paid for some of the studies, took a little bit of the money off that she had to contribute towards financing the educational courses. Some of the professors would come to stay, and so that they could visit other nearby students that also happened to live in a reachable, travelable distance to the house. Or Mr. Porter, getting nearer to the student's door, wondered if it would be the right time or opportunity, perhaps, to just try and ask whether he might be able to talk to the visiting theological professor at some point, just because he had been acquiring a stronger taste and curiosity about theology himself, something he'd never really studied at depth. He'd had to look in down-to-earth issues. Those had been his concerns, to have his professions, to be sustainable, to carry on in his work, and to provide also care for his own family, to learn about his family and friends, to learn about the city, the house that he was living in, and the professions that he'd been occupied within. Well, those had been more than enough, and occupied enough of his time whilst he was doing those. He just didn't feel that he had the time or the energy or the resources in those years, and he didn't have the interest for some reason in such theological ponderings. He'd see it not just as a waste of time, but just as never thought of it as something that was relevant. And yet, strangely, over the last few years, he had had a growing awareness that it was something that intrigued and fascinated him, and yet that he understood so very little about, given the fact that he hadn't studied it that much in so vastly such a long time. He'd had all those thoughts before for a long time and not discussed it with the rest of the family, not at length, not at depth, and not to any of them really. But it hadn't been necessary. He hadn't felt that it was. Not until now. But when he'd heard about the theological student and his studies, it had provoked a renewed interest once more, and reminded him of all his own theological meanderings, his theological thoughts and questions that he still had with no answers, his theological dilemmas and uncertainties and doubts that he'd not discussed at length with anyone, never mind the family in the show family that he was visiting. He'd gone up to visit the student's son, who was there with his own family, because they were blocking the mother's calls, and she'd asked him to go up there. Perhaps she hadn't wanted to go in herself, or felt that Mr. Porter, in his conversations with the student's son, and perhaps with a few of his other student friends, the ones he'd currently gotten to know, perhaps she felt he'd related well to them. They'd opened up to each other a little bit, they seemed friendly and relaxed, and that they were chatting well. Perhaps she felt that he could relate to him more, and that was more likely to obey a request of a visitor and would take it more seriously. He didn't know the reason why, but was happy enough to obey the mother's simple request, and went up there to ask. Perhaps if it was the right time and they were quiet, and he would ask whether he could meet a couple of his professors, or those that he was just interested in the studies of anyway. Whether they would have free time or not, or whether it's something they did, he had no idea on. He doubted they'd be interested in talking to him, or in his own studies, because they were so little, knew so little about them. But obediently, Mr. Porter had ascended the stairs, going up to the student's room, the student's son that he was visiting, edging along the corridor slowly, past all the other guest rooms that were nearby the elder student's son room. Around him were the other guest rooms of the elder children, the ones that visited occasionally still. He went up to the door of the studying son, and whatever friends that he might have that could still be lurking in there. Those visiting friends, he hadn't met any of them yet, and they hadn't been social to join in any of the group family sessions downstairs. Perhaps they weren't expected to. He called out the name several times, as loudly as he could, getting a little louder, but obviously the music, or whatever it was playing in there, was just too loud, so loud that they obviously couldn't hear him, or perhaps were pretending not to. He couldn't be sure, His hand felt so tired after he was knocking for a while, rasping at the knock, knocking loudly, but again still didn't respond. So then he decided to open it a little, was surprised when it opened, thought perhaps it would be locked, but no. He opened it a little, hoping perhaps as he put his head round the door, peering inside, perhaps they would turn and see him, but they didn't, and inside it was thick, thick with smoke, and there were dim lights, and with colours that seemed to be flashing out, beams of light that were projected out across a wall, and it was so dim and smoky, with a thick fog of smoke everywhere, with the projected lights beaming out and flickering and changing so fast, it was really hard to see anything at first. It took quite a while for his eyes to slowly adjust to the light, and to seeing a shadowy figure of groups that seemed to be lurking or sat hunched together in a corner of the room, distantly. Seemed to be a small group of lads that he gradually made out, perhaps with their backs hunched to him, sat in a sort of rounded corner in a group together. He finally seemed to appear to see these shadows huddled in a corner, what appeared to be black figures with the flashing lights of the projector behind them. Mr. Porter carefully then was manoeuvring around some of the cluttered obstacles, chairdrobes ladled with heaps of clothes, several of them, and then there were what appeared to be tables with stacked and piles of towers of books leaning to one side that he awkwardly had to step around. All these cluttered obstacles he gradually made himself around, still calling out, but obviously they weren't hearing anything. They were all plugged into some loud music, and their heads were all turned towards the flashing projected images. It was obviously too loud in their ears for him to hear them. He finally tapped one of them on the shoulders gradually, not knowing what else to do. And the individual jumped suddenly, shouting, turning round, and leapt up, turning to look at the wandering man, who took a step backwards from him, startled himself. Mr. Porter taking a step back, almost tripping over a box placed to one side, with heaped clothes within it. He then apologised, nodding slightly, apologised to the small young man, who was obviously recovering from a small shock. Yet no one had heard the apology, because the others were still standing round, a little startled, looking up to Mr. Porter and the other youth, and laughing a little, realising what he jumped at, because they'd all been suspended watching their own programme, so immersed in it, none of them had expected anyone to be there, and not known what it was at first. Until coming out of the shadowy group, the face of the student's son then appeared to Mr. Porter. He recognised him suddenly, and he read his face, suddenly saw him, and he'd listened to him earlier, and so recognised his voice well when he spoke, who then he saw was happy to see him. It was his old friend that they'd talked to earlier, and he felt it perhaps could have been one of the others, he said. He'd not known who it was, he said, explaining why they jumped, all of them a little, and why the other jumped up, as if he was almost confronting him. And he thought perhaps it was one of the children playing a prank, he said, or just mother checking up on them again. The student's son then introduced himself. He said, as Kit. The older man said he used to be called Kurt. Kurt short for curtains, long ago though. And said that he had more recently, been known as just C, or Seeker Porter. That's why he was known as Mr. Porter. He explained trying to now confirm what his real name was after all the confusion of the names that had gone on earlier. Well, young Kit, the student's son, also then introduced a number of the other faces, saying he was happy to call him Kurt or Siki or anything, whatever he wanted. He said that he preferred to be called Kit around his friends, and then he introduced his friends as young Foal, and then there was Colt, two strapping young guys who both smiled at him. They were both running partners, quite athletic. They worked out together. They smiled back friendly enough and nodded at each other as well in their tracksuits, sports suits that were shiny and well dressed. Yet you had to approach both of them with caution, that's what Kit said, because they were strong-willed. They were both friendly enough at the time, though, and nodded amiably. When you got to know them, they were really nice guys, Kit assured them. A little whelp, introduced Kit. There was little whelp, apparently. Little whelp looked a little wild to the old man when he looked at him, yet was still only really younger compared to the others. And then there was little Lammy as well. Lammy came up and he emerged from the shadowy group to one side. Old Mr. Porter hadn't noticed him. He was quite small, quite young, smiled up feebly, a little playfully. He had a nice friendly smile on him, though. Apparently he was a little shy in introducing himself. And then there was old Calf. There was a tall guy. He'd stayed a bit shadowy. The older man hadn't wanted to look up and meet him. Old Calf. Oh, he was a bigger young man, worked out a lot at the gym. Maybe worked out often, in fact, did a lot of farm work, apparently. Had a friendly smile, but he didn't smile that much or that long. Did some factory job, he said. Strong but silent, apparently, said Kit. And then there was old Joey. Oh, he was sitting down still, hadn't even bothered going up. But he apparently was really into the programme still and turned up to them. He was some sort of athlete too. They met at the gym long ago. Joey, he loved jumping around, play fighting. He was always bouncing off other people, full of energy, on adrenaline rushes, loved sugar and that sort of thing. But he was on a downturn at the moment and just relaxing. He was very young, a little younger than the rest, still in training, and they'd all met together when doing sports training together, long ago apparently. Well, it was a lot for Mr. Porter to take in. Said he couldn't remember all their names straight away. He'd try to later, perhaps. And he nodded at each, trying to smile at them in their own way. Meanwhile, downstairs, Aunt Torina, as she'd now introduced herself, saying she didn't mind Torina if some people preferred, but she'd gone by Toretta, of course, in the past. Whatever, really. She'd always been Torina to her sister, the mum of the children, and to Mr. Dream, Mr. Noah, since she'd met him too. Torina, she was quite happy with. She'd be going on at length talking about her own life at home and how things were to the mother, the couple of children that had remained down there, still eagerly anticipating the opening of the leftover presents that were still there waiting in the lounge to be opened. And Aunt Torina was going on to them still. I don't read, I don't write, I don't watch, I don't film, she was saying in a very serious tone. I don't do any of those things at home, she was saying, long after the food dance was all now over, and they were all digesting, and all resting, and all having their slow chats to each other. And now the adults were downstairs having a slow chat about the media consumptions that they make sometimes. Well, what does she do then? Thought the young woman, not now wanting to question the auntie, the younger child that had been watching and listening to them. I think we all need a break sometimes. I need a break sometimes, said Aunt Torina. I think it all needs a break from me sometimes, she added to herself. At home, I never read or write people. I don't even like watching them, and nobody watches me either. I just don't feel the need for it when I'm at home, stated the aunt. And Mr. Porter, when he'd come downstairs after the talk with the teenagers, had then asked how long she had lived that way, amazed to hear that she'd been living that way for years, in fact. Couldn't believe it. Mr. Porter had said that he watched and read and also wrote about people, but wasn't watched or read or written about by people, not while he was in his home, only perhaps when he went out to others sometimes. Yes, well, sisters, never at home, said the young mother, who was sat beside her. You're always out in other people's shows, aren't you? Said the sister to her. I like to visit other people's shows, of course, she said defensively, and then she explained, turning to Mr. Porter. She had once had a family show, well, long ago, with her passed-on husband, and the other children they'd had, and she visited all their shows now that he passed on, and it got her out of the house, so she didn't feel the need to have any sort of showing at home. There was no need for that, nor when she could be out visiting the children in their grown-up children's shows. Well, I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Porter had said after a long time, before eventually hearing the long, sad ending to Aunt Torina's story, listening with her sister there, and Mr. Noah, Dream, that was sat there with them, also listening sympathetically. And Mr. Porter gave a sympathetic smile to her also. He said, yes, he said he felt it was sad that she'd lost her own show at home, but at least she could still go out to visit other family shows, and the grown-up family shows, the grown-up children's shows. He said they must be a great encouragement to her too, despite the awful loss. and she nodded along, with the mother nodding along sympathetically also too. Then he returned upstairs to try and coach and bring back down the group of teenagers and distract them and get them away from their animal programs that they were watching and that they were so into and immersed into, because they'd not wanted to leave it at all because they were so into it. He tried to appeal to them to come down and see the mother and Aunt Tolina, and there were all the presents there waiting. But no, the elder son had said that she'd be staying for quite a while, and surely he was quite happy to open the present later, and was quite happy for the others to open theirs without him being there, and that he had his friends around visiting, and they didn't really need to be down there anyway. And reassured by that, Mr. Porter had gone downstairs to join in the adult conversation again and to be with them. But then he'd been sent back up there by the mother, who'd said, well, it would be more polite and better, and to try and impress upon the son just how important it was, and how much it would mean to poor Aunt Talina, who'd come all that way and spent all that much time and energy just looking for the right present for him, and really wouldn't have the next time necessarily, tomorrow or the next time, or the day after, to give him the gift and spend the time seeing him with it. So to encourage them to go back down and to implore upon the son why it was so important, Mr. Porter went back up the stairs and went back into a grown-up son's room once more with his friends there. And finally he met the last of the elder son's friends, the student son friends, and the rest of the friends that had been there. The other son, little Pinky, and he had been there. Last and not least, little Pinky, who with his high-pitched girl's voice, a very squeaky voice that sometimes made the others laugh, Mr. Porter tried not to laugh along too. And he also had bursts of hyperactivity racing around the room at great speed and talking at great length too. But he also had much longer resting periods, when he seemed to be asleep for a vastly long period of time as well, when he seemed to have a slow withdrawal and just needed to rest for long times. And he got introduced to this last member of the group, wondering why they'd all take on these animal names, and wanting to ask them about it, but not seeing that it was the right time, perhaps, to. When the curious stranger, Mr. Porter, had visited them, the teenager, the student's son, and his friends, little Pinky was there, lying in some sort of weird bodbex. It was a box bed in a corner of the room, in a dark place where he'd apparently just been resting or sleeping, while the others were immersed in their animal play show of whatever it was they were doing. The elder visitor was amazed that anyone could have slept through all the noise, but then understood that he hadn't perhaps heard it if they were listening through the earpieces. It had seemed so loud, though, from outside the door. So loud, he couldn't believe that anyone would have slept through it. Well, perhaps with the earpiece, he didn't have to hear it all, and could have slept through anything, a storm, or a fire alarm even, a burglary, or any number of things. So your mum is the Catwoman or something, said the elderly visitor to young Kit, with the rest of the group that were there listening to them, looking at him wondering a little. Well, Kits are the sons of skunks too, joked the son, and a few of the group laughed a little. Well, thanks for sharing all your group names. Have you had them all long? Mr. Porter asked. Only about a year, since the farm shows, said Kit. Except for Coy, though, said young Colt snortily, feeling that Coy really wasn't one of them. He was okay with the others together, but he felt nervous to be alone with him for some reason. Something about him he just wasn't sure about yet, and wasn't sure that he really gelled with the rest of the group properly either, that the rest of them didn't feel edgy sometimes when he was around them. Met them at the Ramble shows. That was long ago, said Coy. The projected images of the continued flashing film were still being projected onto one far-flung corner of the cubic small room, and the group sometimes looked over to those images that were still flashing over. We're missing it all, said one of them. You're also missing your visitors downstairs, stuttered the visitor, not sure that he wanted to interrupt them, but feeling that he should do because the mother had implored him. You're missing your aunt. She has come all this way. went on the visitor, now concerned for young Kit, who said he didn't want to miss her that much, and he didn't really, and he could re-watch her later on anyway, and then persuaded Mr. Seeker, whatever his name was, to sit on the empty chair and join them perhaps for a while, if he wanted to, that they could rewind for him, as it hadn't started long ago. And Mr. Porter agreed, perhaps, if only to find what they were watching, just to talk to them a little more. Then at least he'd have some news, something more to share with the mother downstairs, to tell her what they were watching together. Although the private shows that she worried that he was watching wouldn't necessarily be the ones that he was inviting him to join in with, would they? Curious to know what the youths were into, nevertheless, on the mother's behalf, and seeing that they seemed reasonably respectful so far, he'd consented to play watching the film with them and joining them for a short while, seeing that Aunt Torina's stories would go on for long enough, and the mother-sister too, and that perhaps they could wait for a while he got to learn a little more about them, build up some confidence, and then perhaps encourage them to go back and join the rest of the family a little later, he reasoned. And perhaps he could learn a little about whatever this play watch animal film series that they were involved with was. If only for a short while, he promised. And then surely they would have to join the others downstairs in the lounge, if only to open poor Aunt Helena's gifts for them all. Inside the unopened cases, they were still stood down there. One of them even probably had his name on the tag. How would she even know what his original name had been, though? It must be that perhaps the sister had told him, because he told her. Why did people confess other people's personal names to other people, though? Why didn't they just confess their own names, their own personal names? Why tell anyone anyway, unless you knew them personally? Okay, she'd only written it on a small piece of paper, perhaps, and shown it to a close sister, but then that sister could have shown it to all the rest of the family, perhaps, not knowing whether they'd be interested or not. But a process of elimination could have revealed, perhaps, what the name was, if all had been looking at the different labels of all the different luggage. If one of those luggage were singled out for him, and he'd been suspected that that was the case, given what the mother had told him. It could well be that that could reveal the name, but he didn't mind, perhaps, whether they found it out eventually or not. Who knew all the other personal names of anyone? He didn't know all the personal names of the family he'd moved in with. Not at all. The children were now getting impatient. They were lurking downstairs, some of them like vultures, desperate for the other animals to abandon the corpse, so that they could have their feed, so that they could have their share of the gifts too. So many of the gifts had already been given out, but there were so many others that were still waiting, circling with looks that begged with anticipation. Well, if they don't want their presents, said Aunt Helena, when Mr. Porter had finally come downstairs, after finishing up the long play watch of the film that they were involved with. If they don't want it, then they can do it another time. If they don't want their presents, then there's other visitors that do, said Aunt Helena, perhaps a little more upset than she'd meant to sound. This was the aunt's comment. She was now dressed, it appeared, to Mr. Porter, in much more brighter, colourful clothing than she had been before. Now she had been persuaded by the sister to take off some of the more austere greyer clothing that she'd worn for the long, impersonal journey there. She travelled a long journey. Or was it that the heating had been slowly turned up within the house, slowly forcing her to remove layers gradually? Very well, then, said the aunt, not very happy, given the master key slowly over to Mr. Dreams, or whatever his name now was, to Noah, as she knew him as, from the previous visits, the sister's close friend. She gave him the key to all the other suitcases to open on behalf of the children, feeling that she was now too stiff and painful, with her back hurting, to get up and open the other suitcases for the children, allowing him now to do the job for her. You do the honours, Mr. Noah, she'd said to him, the young man, the sister's friend. I'm tired from all the travelling, she said, resting in the chair. I'm sure the others will want their presents later, said the young sister, trying to reassure her. I think they're just having a serious talk up there, to be honest, whispered the sister confidently. Given what he said, she whispered to the aunt, trying to reassure her. The children were too excited, the ones still waiting to open the presents, too excited by the opening of them, to worry about the others' presents, though. Right then, began Mr. Dreams, acting as the giver now. So they each thanked him instead of the aunt, even though he'd only been the one, just to find out the present, read the label, and then call out the names. Is there a Danny Dancer here? Called out Mr. Dreamer. He asked it to the children, looking over at them expectantly, and then the mother looked over too, delighted to see one of them collect his new dance costume, and also new dance instruction videos also. The ones that the mother had show-shopped for him, especially. Then there was Bill, and he was given a new building equipment for his miniature construction projects. They were little intricate mechanical buildings that he could construct during one of the construction shows that he participated in his study shows that he went to at college show. That they had were many different vast parts to the mechanical intricate machines that he was expected to build. They had many moving escalators or different moving floors within the buildings. There were so many different tiny little parts to them, hundreds, thousands of miniature parts, each in their little sealed bags, tens and dozens of those little bags in each of the cardboard boxes, and there were many of the boxes within the bigger package. An incredible amount that he began getting out and to assembling into different parcels and ordering into different groups, as if on an assembly line. If he could assemble it all together, then eventually there were the instructions and a picture of a larger mechanical house that he could perhaps build, a mechanical house that would be on wheels, so that it could be pushed or pulled about the place, and the mechanical floors themselves could somehow move up and down. Perhaps he would get mice to live in there, he suggested to one of the aunts, because they looked about the right size for rodents of that size, given the size of the house that it appeared to be. Yet the mother, looking at this and listening, said that mice built their own houses, and they really didn't need mechanical homes of that sort built for them. Perhaps this was just a miniature house to practice building for larger ones to scale up, and that mice didn't really need to live in human houses themselves. She really didn't want him to be encouraged to get more of them. She'd had enough of getting pets as it was. The aunt had kept quiet during this, not seeing that it was meant as a mice house, although it was just the right size for them nevertheless. Only telling young Billy the Builder, as he was called informally, as a nickname. She told young Billy just to follow all the instructions on the guidance sheets carefully before starting any assembly, and to do it at the right time in the right place, not to open it all now. No, and the mother agreed to him at that time. She said, the mother, not to open it now, as there were too many other people around, too many packages, too many things going on, and all the little pieces would all get lost everywhere. All the little bolts and nuts and screws, and all the little fastening implements and brackets and hinges. Not to open any of it, keep it all sealed, like the aunt said, to open it at the right time and place, and that one of the visiting uncles would do it with them, or perhaps one of the tutors at the show school. And content with that, he left all the different packages unsealed and just content to look at the pictures on the box it came with him. To focus on another building project for another time, he agreed to look at it all much later, with the other builds that he knew, the other builders that he would study it with. If he couldn't figure it all out on his own, or with one of the instructors that he'd be referred to. And then there was young Doc. Well, that's what they called him, Doc, because he seemed to show an interest in doctoring, in studying as a medical doctor of some sort. So he was given a nickname at an early age as Doc. Just made sense. He got his first stethoscope, but it was a special kind. This was a different one that he'd never seen before, and it had a recorder attached to it. so that it could actually record an audio version of the reading itself. And he could also then adjust the volume to different levels so that it was more listenable too, and so he could focus on the different audio parts. And he also insisted that it would have to be tried out a later time when he'd be able to look at it more focusedly, and then he could read the instructions of how it would work. He was good already at a younger age of reading people's pulses, of taking a pulse, reading people's heartbeats. He could well measure a heart rate and all sorts of things at a very young age, the mother had said, confiding to her sister, sat beside her, who'd then gone on to joke she was glad of it. At least she wouldn't be mistaken as a dead person if she was passed out later after one too many. She'd said it meaning it was a joke or some sort, just meaning and having a little laugh to Mr. Porter and a few of the other older adults, although the sister had looked serious, thinking a few of the children might have overheard and might have been upset, but they didn't seem to be, although the sister did not really find it amusing around the children to say this. But poor Sister Talina was a little ill herself, and perhaps her comedy sometimes was just her way of coping with her life, the way she was living. The elder daughter, Caterina, as she was sometimes known, she had then come in from the kitchen into the large lounge area to join the adults that remained within there. Mr. Porter, that was sat down in one of the lounges, and then there was Mr. Dream, Noah Dream, who was sat down there, and then there was the mother with her sister, Aunt Talina, that was sat there, a few of the children that were still looking at their various presents and studying and inspecting them also. Eldest daughter Caterina had come in too, still with her dirty apron attached to her, and with the dirty hair that was still wet as well. She'd finished up washing up, put away all the clean plates, and then bringing a tray of drinks in for the adults. Finally, she'd arrived home from work. "Ah, well, I'm guessing you're the little chef then?" asked Noah. And then he looked over to her and then gave her the gift, giving over the box that he handed to Caterina. And she accepted it, nodding to him slightly. "Well, little kitchen assistant, here's your gift," said Mr. Dreamer, nodding to her, theatrically even. And she answered him, accepting the present from him, although she really nodded over towards the aunt. "I do washing up and drying too, not just cooking," stated Big Kit, as she was sometimes known, as a way of differentiating her from young Kit, who was still upstairs with his friends, of course. But old Kitterina, as she was often known, also liked to do lots of other kitchen work. She wasn't just there cooking, and she was also doing lots of other cleaning, besides many other work, too. She went over sitting beside her dear Aunt Torina, presenting her with a large hug, embracing her, soaking her a little with a splash from the sink. "If only they washed and dried themselves and put themselves away," said the old auntie to her as she freed herself from the embrace. And smiling, looking into her, despite the wetness, she had said, "Oh, she's a big kit now," she stated towards the mother, inspecting her, sat beside the aunt, and picking a little food out of Big Kittalina's hair. "And little Kit is upstairs still," said the mother. "She's the big Kit. Glad to see now," as she was opening up a new funky chef's hat. It was an electronic chef's hat that would tell the temperature of the room even, and could hold all of the hair within it at the back in a very stylistic way that looked quite nice, quite funky, the mother had said. And the young Catalina said she loved the feel of it too. It didn't look or feel too weird, as some of the other chefs' hats did sometimes. She tried it on in different positions, and the aunt and the mother looked at it interestedly and laughed a little, as she struggled to get her hair fitted within it still. Yet the mother seemed more interested in some of the newer kitchen utensils that had also fallen out of the package onto the sofa too, and intrigued they were looking up and reading what they were, studying them too, with big Kittalina sat beside them, looking too, puzzling to see over what they were. puzzling over the purposes of what the implements and the kitchen utensils meant, seeing it as a challenge to try and interpret them. More than anything, they looked a challenge rather than just being fun to use. It turned out that they were actually instruments to help sculpt food of some sort, to create food sculptures. They were edible ornamental food. These apparently were meant to be edible ornaments that could be placed around the house. In case visitors fancied snacking, they could just simply snack on the ornaments if they wanted to. It was to have nicely displayed tables, and also, Aunt Tolina had added, to the young Kitterina, who was sat intrigued and a little mystified by the whole idea, you could also sculpt your own plates, cups, knives and forks, all out of food itself. So you didn't have to do the washing up. You could just eat the plates afterwards that were sculpted out of edible material. There were the utensils to help do this, and also there were a few other books as a guide how to do it too. Aunt Terina had told young Kitterina, while the mother was listening in attentively, intrigued, but a little unsure if it was really that suitable or something that they would really have that much of a need for.